Just as a realtor, you're expected to know the contract, right? Here's the thing. You're viewed as the expert in your client's eyes. I don't care if you've been doing this for 20 years or 20 days. You have a client, they view you as the expert. Ask yourself, are you the expert really? You can ask any realtor with 5 or more years of experience, and by experience, I mean production, not just a license. And they're going to tell you that every single transaction is a new learning experience. It's like shaking a dice cup to see if the numbers stay the same. They don't. There's so many different possibilities of what can happen. And today, we hope to cut down some of that learning curve. And your basic knowledge of the RPA, it might help you avoid some oversights. Oversight can cost your clients inconvenience, or worse, money, or worse yet, the sale, despite your oversight or answering a question wrong. Even if none of that happens, you don't want to be that agent where the other agent on the other side is constantly correcting you and bailing you out of bad situations. That does not do well when you get to negotiation time. I'll say this class, it won't make you an expert. Always be careful using the word expert as far as I am an expert at anything. Be careful. But it is a great refresher for an experienced agent. I'd take it. If I wasn't teaching, I'd be on it. I'd be sitting and watching it. For newer agents, it's going to provide enough knowledge to fill out the contract competently and also explain the what's and the whys. And most importantly, though, it's going to show you how and where to find the answers to many of those questions that you're going to be asked. Okay? Knowing where to research. If you're an attorney, you got a library. You don't know all the laws and the civil codes and all that, but you know where to look it up, don't you? All right, here we go. Fact, the average person buys every 7 to 10 years. At best, most of the buyers and sellers are way out of practice with the contract, right? At worst, the realtor's out of practice too. Okay, we have a lot of information to cover, and I want to be efficient and respectful of your time. Most of the questions you might have may get answered as we go along. But if you need clarification or something doesn't make sense, please feel free to speak up. But write down your questions. If they don't get answered by the end of this class, let's go ahead and do it then. 3 hours is really not enough time to cover every possible thing, every document related to the RPA. So some of this is going to be touching on things in more general terms. So please take notes. Remember, the idea is to know where to find things. Every answer to every question is answered. Every one of your questions, your client's questions, is answered within the documents. You just got to know which documents to look at. Questions. Technically, what's a residential purchase agreement? A bilateral agreement between parties that outlines the terms of a title transfer and property sale. Each party has conditions and requirements to fulfill within certain timeframes. Simple, right? So our job is to navigate the journey of the fiduciary client duties, make sure everything's completed on time, and provide clarity for the escrow process from contract to close. Okay, simple? Not really. What could possibly go wrong? Let me count the ways. The hope here is for this class to reduce the errors and omissions that are within your control. Okay, some stuff isn't within your control. Most of it is. Simple today, simple agenda. Okay, that's it. We're going to go through the contract. We're going to unbundle the contract docs. We're going to go through the RPA itself, and we're going to do a practice contract. We'll call it a mock contract. All right. So let's first look at what we call the contract bundle, the stuff that comes with the contract when you submit, that you need to include with the contract. Okay. 10 things. There's a lot of stuff, isn't it? 7 of these documents automatically populate with zip forms. Zip forms is great. It does a lot of work for you. 3 of those documents you need to pull from the KW menu website. If you're not familiar with that, get with Luis. I advise you pull them once and put them into your RPA template. So they're always going to be there when you draw up a new contract. You don't have to go pick and choose documents. And that's not fun. So we're going to go through all of these very briefly, just enough to understand what they contain and why we need them. Once again, the big things to know which questions to ask and where the answers are located. The old saying, you don't know what you don't know. Careful of that. Okay, so the least you should know in the bundle. Starting with this one, agency disclosure. This defines the different roles. Defines what a buyer agent. You represent the buyer, the agent representing the seller, a dual agent. It defines it. Then it goes through your fiduciary responsibility and it also says you're obligated to disclose any material facts that you're aware of. So if you know that the garage floods in the winter when it rains and your seller says, no, just keep that our secret. No. And fiduciary is defined as care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty to your clients. They used to say obedience. Loyalty is a better word. Okay. And the other part of it is let's say you represent the buyer, which in this case you do, we'll say you treat everyone in the contract, everyone honestly and fairly and in good faith. That includes the seller, the inspectors, everyone. Okay. Be the first document that you have to explain in the contract. Next one. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. This document, it provides consent for you to represent both sides. Dual agency. If either your buyer or the seller, any party refuses to sign it, you need to refer one of the other out to a different agent. You can't represent both unless they consent to it. That's what this form is for. Keep in mind the co-op agent. If the co-op agent is from the same brokerage, from KW Coastal or Salinas, that's technically dual agency. Even though you wouldn't be working both sides yourself, it's still technically dual agency. Okay. The biggest concern about dual agency is disclosing confidential information to the other party. It's still illegal in 8 states. For 6 years, I practiced real estate in Texas, and it's illegal there. Can't do it. There's ways around it, but you can't do it. So be really careful in dual agency. In fact, we discourage it to all except for the most experienced agents because there's so many things that could go wrong. The worst question you can hear is, whose side are you on anyway? Okay? Even with experience, you need to be cautious. Next one, buyer's inspection advisory. It's actually called the buyer's investigation advisory. That's a typo. One of your buyer's most important obligations, right, is to investigate and inspect the property. This document outlines that responsibility, calls out the big points, has straightforward advice to protect their interests. Make sure they read it because they have to sign it. Okay. Fair housing discrimination. California takes it seriously. Yeah. This provides some of the critical details of the law. Don't just brush over and say, oh, I have to make you sign this. It's a big deal. Next one. Insurance. Insurance, has it got easier or harder to get lately? Okay. So this basically, because of all the wildfires and the disasters and the potential for more disasters, it just covers the main points of the market and the challenges of the market. And it provides resources for navigating through it all, websites, etc. Sure they get this. Spend some time on this one with your clients. This is a real dangerous threat, not just your clients, but to you. Okay. You need to talk to them about, don't ever share private information via regular mail or email. Verify requests that deal with money or any kind of private information with the phone call. If the title company says, hey, I need all your numbers to do a wire, call that title officer personally and say, was that you? Is that correct? Make sure it's coming from the right person. Check through the originating email and the originating text addresses. It might, be covered where it looks like it's them. Make sure it's really their email. Make sure it's really their text, their phone number. It only takes one swipe, one mouse click to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've known 2 people where that's happened to. Both are brokers. One of them, it happened to his client. It was $140,000, and he wrote a check for $140,000 to his client to cover that. The other one was for a little bit less. It was for a deposit. I think it was like $20,000 or $25,000. So it happens.
Mike,
Yes, sir.
are you going to provide these slides? Because I just want to make sure people know that those are available after.
Yeah, and we're also recording this class
No problem.
as well. Yeah.
No.
And we're going to post it up to YouTube for future. Okay. We're going to continue to do the classes, but we're going to also have that as a reference. This one here, Consumer Privacy Act, is simply put, it's basically says you do a real estate transaction, you're dealing with a lot of different entities and your private information, you might be put on mailing lists and things like that. Okay. There's also some KW specific documents we talked about. Okay. Affiliated business arrangement or disclosure. This is a common form for large real estate offices where they have involvement in other businesses. It fulfills our disclosure requirements for any affiliated businesses that our ownership group has interest in. Okay. But it has to be done. You'll get these from other offices too. Electronic signature, or I'm sorry, we're on to that one next. Coastal Estates Advisors, it basically says that we don't guarantee the status of permits or whether something was done, according to code, anything like that. We don't guarantee that your kid's going to get in that school that you think is zoned there. We don't guarantee the views, property size, square footage. It basically states, buyer, it's your job. You need to investigate thoroughly. This is already contained within the regular documents. This pulls it out and makes it more important. This is a critical document, by the way. And this is the last one, the electronic signature advisory. Some of your older buyers may never have used DocuSign or anything like that. They haven't bought or sold a house in years, so be careful. If that's the case, then, great, let's teach them how to use it. But take your time to explain how it works and explain their obligation to read it and to understand it and to ask questions that they need where need be. The biggest thing with DocuSign is people just go from signature field to signature field. They zip through it with a tab and they don't really read it. Make sure they understand they still need to read the contract. I like the idea of sending them a PDF first or even a paper copy if they're older people and drop it by and say, study that. And then if it looks good, the same thing is I'm going to post it up on DocuSign. Okay. Okay. So that's the bundle, unwrapping the bundle. Okay. So let's get on to the main event. All right. The RPA contract, 17 pages, has 34 sections, all kinds of nuance. And depending on the escrow, what happens during that escrow, there may be a bunch more documents on top of that. And that doesn't include paperwork that comes from the seller, the listing company, listing office, the title company, the inspectors, etc. So it's your job, as we said before, to help your clients understand the contract. You have to know it well enough to teach it. I'll say that again. You have to know it well enough to teach it. And today we're just going to chunk it down, small pieces. And we're going to refrain from too many of the little details because, we're going to remember typically 20% of what we are told. And so we're going to try to make sure that it's a good 20% that you remember. And once again, please take notes. Please take notes on some of this. You'll be happy later. All right. It's a mixture. The RPA, it's a mix of covenants and contingencies. Let's define that. A covenant, it's a promise. Something that has to occur by a certain date. And if it doesn't occur, the promising party, the person who makes the promise, is in default or in breach. A good example of that is the deposit to escrow within 3 business days. Or I'm going to close in 30 days. That's a covenant. Now, contingency, the other part of this, it's something that may or may not happen. And if it does, the transaction can close. If it doesn't, either party has rights to cancellation. No penalty. Contingency, an example of one is your loan, the loan contingency. If you can't get approval, you can't close, right? Best example I could think of. Okay, remember that. So I'm going to need you all to follow along with me. Everybody should have your paper copy of the handout that we either printed or emailed to you. And it's just an RPA right at this point. As I said, there's 34 sections. Now the contract, they've referred to them as paragraphs. They're not really paragraphs, but that's how they refer to them. So if you're an English teacher, you might cringe here. But since that's how they're referred to, that's what we call them. But I still say sections, and I won't change that today. Right now, let's go to page 1 of the RPA. So sections 1 and section 2. Page 1 of the RPA. It'll be just past your agency disclosure form. Okay, see that where it says paragraph 1 and 2, offer an agency. Simple. That's the basic stuff. The buyer's name, property address, the AP number, confirmation of agency. There's a checkbox. That checkbox is automatically there though, right? You don't have to put that in. That will be there for you. That's saying that there's no choice on whether or not to provide that dual agency disclosure, the PRBS. Now you can get most of this info that you need on the property, etc., from the MLS listing, but always verify with the real list report. So far as seller names, the addresses, and the AP number, be accurate. Because if a listing agent does a counter offer on a spelling error, it doesn't look so good. Doesn't look so good. It means you're not paying attention. Not paying attention to detail. It's more important than you might think. Okay. The next. Part 3, paragraph 3 and 4. Part 3 and 4. Terms, allocation of costs. This is the meat and potatoes of the contract. It spells out the offer for the buyer, the buyer's offer. This is the part you fill in. Okay, basically it's fill in the blanks, but it's critical blanks. It's in grid format, which is a gigantic improvement over the old style. And the main reason I think we can get through this class under 3 hours. The old contract, not a chance. But we'll see. We'll see. Part 3 and 4. You see that, right? You see that grid to start? Now the grid. Who remembers in this room the old school libraries and the Dewey Decimal System? Cross-reference, right? Well, the designers of the RPA, I think they were inspired by that here. Okay, on this grid. You can see this up here. This is the grid. Each section has a little grayed out area here with the items. And the very first column where you see A, B, C, D, right, going down, that's, okay, item A, item B, item C. Now, some of them might have parts like D1 and D2. Well, let's stick with item A for now, item A. Now, the next column where it says para number, that's the section where you can go to get the information you need about this particular term. So for item A, purchase price, go to paragraph or part 5. It gives you all the information you need to know about the purchase price, or 5B if it's cash. Everybody sees that? And obviously the paragraph title of the contract term is, we're going to stick with purchase price. That's the next column. Or it could be close of escrow, or it could be expiration of offer. Those are all the different terms that we're going to be offering on. The next column where it says terms and conditions, this is the part you fill in. For example, under purchase price, this is where you put in the price. Simple, huh? Under close of escrow, how many days or what date? Expiration of offer. There's a default, 3 calendar days. You don't have to do anything. 3 calendar days after all signatures. Or if you want to make it something different, if you want to shorten that up or extend it, you can. The 4th column is additional terms. There might be some, for example, if it's a purchase price, if it's an offer of $900, if it's all cash, you want to check that box. If it's not all cash, then leave it alone. Simple. Okay. We're going to go through these terms, these conditions, and more today. And as far as the grid, we're going to come back to that. We're not going to go through the grid right now. I mean, when we go through it, we're going to fill out a mock contract live. Okay. I think it's much easier to do it, be shown and do it at the same time than for me to just tell you. All right. And we'll come back. That'll be the last part of the class. So right now, please turn to page 4 of your RPA. And look for section 5 and section 6. You see that? Paragraph 5 and 6. Okay, that's talking about the money. The money. Show me the money. Okay. And starting with the deposit. You can see, you can read along if you want. But it talks about how the buyer's deposit is handled. By default, it's wire transfer. If it's wire transfer, great. That's the way it's going to be. But if it's going to be something different, like a cashier's check, you're going to have to put that in there, in the contract, in the grid. Now, sometimes the buyer is going to make an increased deposit. Why would a buyer make an increased deposit? Well, let's say they want to start, if it's $1 million house, 3% is 30,000. They want to put in 1.5%, 15,000 now, and then wait till the contingencies are over, put the other 15,000 in. Not the best practice if you want to get the seller to accept your offer right now, but it happens. There's different reasons for this. Sometimes it'll be an incentive to add more deposit should certain things happen. But if you're going to do an increased deposit, there's a form for it. It's called the increased deposit addendum. Critical. You can't just put in more money and call it a day. Okay. And so it's filled out, very simple form. Be sure to fill in the portion that incorporates the increased funds into liquidated damages. Okay. Be sure of that. That's the critical part here. We're going to get into that more later. So hold your questions on how that works. Okay. Back to where we were. Cash or loan, right? Process for a cash offer is in there. If it's a cash offer, no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency by default. You can add an appraisal contingency if you want, but by default, there's not going to be one. Now, the buyer is going to have to provide proof too that they have the money to pay that cash. You want to do that with the offer. As Jeff said, have your ducks in a row when you start. Next part, the buyer loan status. In the contract itself, it says the seller and the agent, their agent, have permission to contact your lender and verify that you're really qualified and to keep in touch as the process goes on. That did not used to be the case years ago, but it is now. Okay. By default, which means you don't have to check anything, it's a conventional loan. But the contract leaves room for other types like VA loan, FHA. Maybe there's going to be a second deed of trust, a first and a second, seller financing, etc. Different kind of financing is possible. But that's in there. Terms of the loan. Well, that's where you fill in, and we're going to get into that when we get to the grid later. You fill in the maximum interest rate that you're willing to absorb in your loan. The points the buyer is willing to pay. Is there a junior loan attached to it? Are there any other terms that need to be put in there? Okay, you got to be full disclosure to the seller. They need to know exactly what's happening here, so that they can make a good informed decision on whether to accept your offer and that based on the finance. Okay, states in there the down payments deposited with the escrow company at their instruction. Buyer credits. We'll get into that with the grid. One thing to know is there's a limit that a lender allows. So before putting in buyer credit, I'm not talking about the commission, I'm talking about buyer credit, the closing costs and that sort of thing. Make sure the lender allows it before putting it in there. Let's say you put in I want $30,000 in buyer credits for this and that. Lender says all I can approve is 20. Well, all your buyer's going to get is 20. Seller keeps the 10. Check with your lender. Finally, you got to show proof of funds to close. Your closing costs and your down payment. Or cash if it's all cash. It's best to provide that with the offer, not 3 days later. Strength and draw. Okay. That's paragraph. Look, we're already on paragraph or part 7. We're moving along. Okay, as we go. Part 7, closing and possession. Y'all see it up there? Anybody answer that? What does it matter? And why do you need to check off whether it's a primary residence, a secondary residence, or an investment property? Why?
Well, if you get a loan, Mike, and you say it's a primary residence, you get a more favorable interest rate. And if you are lying about that, you're committing a federal crime.
I couldn't have said
That's
it better
law.
myself. Could not have said it better myself. 100%. So make sure that
Of
your
course, if you're going
client,
to commit a crime, if
pardon
you're
me?
going to commit a crime, it ought to be federal. I say, Mike, if you're going to commit a crime, it ought to be a federal crime.
Yeah, you might as well. It's probably, I think I heard the prisons are better. So yeah. Okay. So who's going to live there? It's covered in here. Is it going to be delivered vacant? Is the house going to be tenant occupied? Does the seller need to stay a little bit longer after closing? Because they can't quite move in time, right? Might be other addendums required if it's anything other than vacant. So let's take a look at what might be required if it's not going to be delivered to you vacant, ready to go. Starting with tenant occupied. It's called the TOPA form, TOPA. It's used whenever there's a tenant in the property. Even if the tenant is going to be out before closing, you still need the TOPA. Okay. And in the TOPA, it states the seller needs to provide any leases to the buyer. And if the tenant's going to stay, security deposits, prorated rent, that sort of thing, that'll be passed on to the buyer by the escrow company at closing. Those funds are held in escrow. And when at closing, the buyer gets them. If the buyer gets half a month's rent or whatever. Okay. Tenant estoppel certificates should be included for good measure. That's where the tenant actually writes statements on what's, what their status is and their leases, their deposits, etc. How long they've been there. Okay. There's also disclaimers in here. So make sure when you use this form, or actually for any form, read it, understand it yourself before you have your client sign it. Don't just say, hey, you got tenants, let's sign this. Bad practice. Next one, sellers in possession. The seller needs to stay a little bit longer. I can't move out. I need 5 days after the buyer has to close. You don't want to delay the escrow. Well, that's when it's used. Only if the seller's staying for 29 days or less. If it's more than 29 days, we'll get to that next. This is not a lease. It's a license. We've gone over this in our sales meeting if you attended that class, by the way, or that section. Okay. The daily rent that the seller pays the buyer would be included in there, but it's not called rent. It's called a license fee, daily license fee. And the deposit, what we would call a deposit, a security deposit, is actually considered a delivery of possession fee. Don't confuse the two. They serve the same purpose, but don't confuse them. For this arrangement, the seller in possession does not have full tenant's rights. They do have the rights of private and quiet enjoyment, all that kind of stuff, but they can't, if they decide to stay and, there's no 60 days or eviction or any of that kind of stuff. It's like, no, you're in breach, you're in default. I could sue you for damages. Okay. So if the seller is going to stay for 29 days or less, use the SIP form, seller in possession. Okay, if it's more than 29 days, if it's 30 days or more, then it's called residential lease after sale. This really is a regular lease with all that additional paperwork and disclosures that go with it. Okay, but if it's more than 29 days, this is what you need because you can't do the license for longer than 29 days. Be cautious if let's say the seller says, I need 90 days. And the buyer says, fine, that's great, because we're not even going to move for 4 months. Be cautious. Why?
But then you have a tenant, and tenants are a pain in the ass.
Okay, you got that. What else, though? What's a bigger deal?
Well, you get the liability, they may damage the house, and who's responsible.
What? You got all that, but
The
lender, generally, they don't allow more than 60 days. If it's being purchased as a primary residence, they might have a problem with that. And they may not approve the loan if it's more than 60 days. Not all, I think the majority. Talk to Shane or your favorite lender about that, be cautious of that. Okay. Back to where we were. Condition on closing. Unless it's otherwise agreed, the home is sold. This is all in this, all the documents that you're following along with. I just took the easy parts out. The home is sold as is in its present condition as of the date of contract. That's in the contract. That's how the house is sold. Seller is not required to fix nail holes from pictures being taken down. But if it's like a big gaping hole, I'd say bigger than a quarter or a nickel even, fix it. But they're not required to. Debris, personal property, and all that needs to be removed by closing of escrow or upon delivery to the buyer if there's a seller in possession or something like that. Okay? That's what the contract says. Now, of course, it's subject to the buyer's ability to ask for repairs and all that, but we're not talking about that yet. When is the buyer? The buyer gets the keys upon notice of recording or according to other written agreement, which you'll see in the contract. We'll go through that. Lastly, sellers are obligated to share any passcodes or warranties, that sort of thing, at the time of closing. Okay. Moving on, part 8. Contingencies. They can seem complex, but they're not. Let me define a contingency. It's a description. First of all, it's a description of the event. For example, loan approval is a contingency. It's the time period in which the event must occur. It's essentially who has the right to cancel if the event does not occur. Okay. Arrangements. What arrangements can be made to avoid cancellation if the contingency is not satisfied? And what is the method for service of the notice of cancellation? Okay. That's it in a nutshell. The most confusing contingency for some, though, is a contingency for the buyer to sell their current home in order to buy this one. There's a document for that. We call it the COP, contingency of for other property. Basically, it's the buyer has to sell their house in order to buy this house. All right. Depending on how it's written up, there's different ways to write it up or to fill it out for the terms. It can allow the buyer time to get the home listed if it's not listed yet. It could allow the buyer time to get it under contract, whether it's listed or not. And it can give the buyer time to close and still keep that contingency. If those things don't happen in the agreed upon timeframes, then the seller can demand either after notice to perform, can either demand the contingency is removed or cancel if the buyer can't or won't. We're going to go over the notice to perform and all that shortly. So like we said, write the questions down. If you've had less than 10 transactions, I'm telling you this as your broker, if you've had less than 10 transactions using a COP form, do not go forth without either another experienced or more experienced realtor checking it out, or B, let me look at it before signature. This document can create a lot of problems and a lot of confusion with the different options that it offers. Okay. And it's probably not the best if you're in a multiple offer. It's probably gonna, be cautious. Sellers never like these, but they exist and they happen. Okay. Everything stays in effect. All contingency. They don't get, even though you have a 17-day loan contingency, right? It's still day 20. It could still be a contingency unless you've removed it in writing. And there are forms to get this done. Okay, we will get to those coming up here. Part 9, inclusions exclusion. What's a fixture? Anyone?
Something that is affixed to the house.
Pretty much. An object permanently attached to the property by way of bolts, screws, nails, hardware, glue, cement, anything like that. Things like built-in appliances, screens, chandeliers, ceiling fans are generally seen as fixtures. Also, dedicated items, dedicated to the property itself, like security systems, smart home features, window treatments, pool equipment, stuff like that specific to the property. So much confusion with fixtures, I'll tell you right now. So when you're in doubt, you'll see in the contract, you'll see what you're looking at right now under Part 9. It defines it pretty well. But if you have doubt on whether it's included, put it in when you write the RPA under inclusions. The biggest sources of confusion on these are like window treatments. You see these beautiful drapes. And then you come in and then you see the target drapes when you move in. That causes a problem. Same with chandeliers and light fixtures and things like that. What's excluded by default are most sellers' personal property. Most of it, unless the buyer includes it and seller agrees to leave it. Leased or lien, if there's leased items, things that are you're leasing, like security systems, etc., or liened items, things that you're making payments on, the seller has to disclose those and provide the documents along with their disclosures. The buyer has to approve those. Okay. There's also a spot for exclusion of what the buyer doesn't want. You write that in there. I don't want that ugly ass hot tub that's sitting on the porch. I want that removed, even though it's, it might be considered a fixture, maybe not, but make sure you're clear on this stuff with your clients. Big thing if you're in an area where there's propane, the propane tank, and it's let's say it's an owned tank, and all of a sudden you move in and it's empty. The seller took it, or the seller locked it. So I want you to pay me for that. It's my personal property. There's been debates over that, and there's two sides of it. Doesn't matter, but just be careful. If it's a propane tank, put in under inclusions all the remaining propane in the tank outside. Just be specific. Big note. Exercise caution, because in this a lot of bad blood is spilled. And if it's in the MLS, says refrigerator included. Beautiful refrigerator included, washer dryer included, all the potted plants and all that are all included. And then you write the contract up and you close. You don't put that stuff in there, even though it's in the MLS or the flyers. It's all removed. Seller didn't do anything wrong. It's got to be written up in the RPA. Don't just take the marketing word for it. A lot of bad blood's been spilled on misunderstandings about what stays and what goes. Verbal means smack. Okay. Means smack. All right, now we're on part 10. We are clipping along here. Allocation of costs. Okay. It covers the contract portion of who pays for what, and also how that makes sense. Now, a lot of agents are not clear on the part under government reports, inspections, retrofits, and compliance on what how that works. Someone give me an example of what is a retrofit or compliance item. Government.
Sewer lateral in most areas around here.
Yes.
Toilets.
Shower head.
Toilets.
Mm-hmm. So when you check that box, usually we check the seller pays it, right?
Yeah.
And then time comes, it turns out you need a new sewer lateral. I'm not paying for that. Now the listing agent should have explained that to the seller, but try to be clear. There needs to be clarity on everybody's part when that comes up. Another confusion source is who pays for reinspection fees if they're required. Well, if the repairs are not done on time by the seller and the lender requires that reinspection, because of that, the seller is responsible for both the additional inspection and also any buyer costs that were caused by the late repairs or other seller obstacle. And where that comes into really murky waters is if the buyer loses their loan lock. Okay. And this also includes if the seller does repairs but doesn't do them right, like tries to save money and does the section 1 himself. And the inspection comes up, no, didn't get done right. So just be aware of all this. And on the other hand, if anything's caused by the buyer error or the buyer's actions, then the buyer has to pay for that. And we'll be going under allocation of costs when we do the lot contract. Statutory disclosures. These are required by law unless the seller is exempt. Okay. These are things that has to be provided. They cannot be waived. The buyer can't say, I don't need it, and waive them in writing. Okay. I'll tell you though, sometimes the seller just refuses. You got this seller who the listing agent took 5 years to get him to finally list the house. I'm not going to do a damn thing except sign the contracts. I'm not going to give him any damn disclosures. That happens once in a while, doesn't it? Well, if that does happen and you can't get it, and the buyer still wants to buy the house, there's really not a workaround, but you want to save all that correspondence where you, as the buyer's agent, made attempts to get it from the seller, and then the listing agent gives you the email back, and any backup, any communication from the seller says, I'm not going to do it. So you have a record that you are unable to get it. The seller refused, but I want to close anyway, and you can. Just keep that record. Okay. Later on, maybe the reason the seller didn't want to say anything is because of the garage that floods every year. But you want to give the buyer the chance to investigate. You know, the buyer, we have no disclosures, buyer to investigate to their own, satisfaction. Okay. All right. Now, source of confusion. It's a question: who actually qualifies as an exempt seller, right? We'll go over that in a minute. I'm going to go over that in a minute. But even if a seller is exempt from disclosure, some of the statutory disclosures, because some sellers are exempt, there are certain ones that they still have to provide, even if exempt. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. First, let's go over what is an exempt seller. Okay. Probate, foreclosure, bankruptcy, court-ordered sale, government entity. If a fiduciary, like the trustee who's never lived on the property of an estate. Okay.
What about if somebody owns a home, but they let their parents live in it, but they didn't live there, but they're the owner on title?
That question is going to be answered in 2 slides.
Cool.
2 slides.
Okay.
But hold that question. If I don't answer it completely, the next slide after this. Exempt sellers still must provide. It's called an ESD, exempt seller disclosure form. There are questions on there that have to be answered to their knowledge. Death on property, so on and so forth. They still have to provide the lead disclosures, the natural hazard disclosure, and big one, actual knowledge and material facts. Just because they're exempt doesn't mean they don't have to share things they already know to be true about the property. If they visited every summer in grandma and grandpa's house, they're exempt seller, and every summer the garage flooded and the neighbors were aware of it, and then the thing closes, and the neighbors tell the new owners, by the way, the garage flooded every year. Oh yeah, the grandkids were there, and conversations start, and you get big problems. So be careful of this. Now, big note: if the owner has never ever lived at the property, doesn't matter. It's still they're not exempt, even if it's been a rental. Even if if they're on title, they're the actual owner, unless there's a power of attorney. Okay. If the seller's never left his home in Jersey, not exempt. If the seller's an LLC, not exempt. But another not exempt. If it's a trustee of an estate, right, which is exempt, right, who has either owned the property before or lived there in the past year, not exempt. Even if they just spent a week there, not exempt. Did I answer that completely?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. All right, moving along. We're on part 12.
Okay, I have a question. Sorry, Mike. So even though they're not exempt, would I still have them sign the exempt?
ESD?
Yeah, ESD.
Yeah, if they're exempt, they have to sign that and fill it out.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a very simple form. It's 1 page, and it's just a series of questions. Some of the same questions that are on the SPQ.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And buyer's investigation. Part 12 talks about the buyer's investigation. And it's referenced back from the grid. Just so you know, all these things we're talking about are referenced back. You got a buyer that's going to really, dig into that contract. They're going to be looking at this stuff that we're talking about right now, just so you know. Okay. In that, of course, the buyer has the right to inspect during the contingency period, right? That's what it says. If the inspector needs to do something like drill a hole, remove materials, move heavy personal property or any kind of invasive inspection, even removing a rug, the seller has to provide written approval. If you represent the buyer and let's say you see a sofa with a really nice rug underneath, the inspection gets done, you close. And let's say the buyer moves in and the sofa's gone, the rug's gone, and there's a little black spot there. It's like maybe about as big as a pancake. You call somebody out and it turns out it's mold, and it turns out that mold has just spread all over the place underneath the flooring. Turns out the buyer is allergic to mold, deathly allergic to mold, can't live there. House cost over $2 million. He paid cash. The buyer wants to give the house. I can't take this house. Big problem. That's a true story. It's a true story. And so be careful. I mean, advise your buyers to, if the inspector is going to say, hey, I couldn't get access underneath there. Because I'm not moving the refrigerator, or I'm not going to move I advise a reinspection. Go for that reinspection, even if and that would be the buyer's responsibility to pay for it. But say, hey, seller, can you get that stuff arranged to be moved for me so I can go out and reinspect? Okay. It only takes one bad situation to make you go, whoa, I better do it. Be more careful. Okay, the seller has to make the property allow access at reasonable times. Okay. 1 a.m, because I feel like I want to go measure for furniture. No, but at reasonable business hours and weekends, they need to allow access. Okay. They can't shut off the utilities. There's confusion there because, hey, it's under contract. I'm going to shut off I don't live there anymore. I'm going to shut off everything. No, they have to keep them on. Okay. If there's any damage that comes from the buyer's inspections, the buyer's responsible to repair or replace. Okay. This is all written down in what you're following along with, by the way. All right. The buyers say they don't want inspections. Does that happen? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a process for that. First off, tell them that's the worst idea I've ever heard. If they still don't listen to you. Okay. We have 2 documents, very important. One's called the buyer inspection waiver. One's called the buyer investigation elections. Let's take a quick look at it. Just a piece of it. The inspection waiver, if they choose not to do a home inspection, they choose not to do a termite inspection or an additional inspection that was recommended by one of those people, they have to do the buyer's inspection waiver. And they have an initial, for example, home inspection waiver, initial, wood destroying pests, initial, so on and so forth. If you don't, you're acting against the advice of brokers. This puts your advice to them in writing. That helps if they regret it later and they want to go after you. It's not fail safe, but it helps. The other one, buyer's investigation elections. If the buyers think they don't need inspections, well, tell me what you do want. And then leave the other boxes unchecked. So you're saying that you don't want those. This adds another layer to confirming it was their decision, whereas you advised them otherwise in writing. And this form has saved us more litigation than you know. A lot of years ago, in my very first brokerage, we developed our own form. It was almost identical to this. It was not a CAR form, but it was our in-house form. And then years later, we were really happy to see that CAR implemented this and put it in the zip form libraries. It's almost word for word. And now you might have a buyer that says, I want all that. I want all this stuff done. Okay. That's going to cost you roughly $10,500. It's fine. And they go, okay, I still want it done. Then go to it. Get it done. Let them do it. The biggest cause of every litigation is buyers finding something wrong with the house later because either A, and they're always going to blame the seller. Then they're going to blame the seller's agent. Then they're going to blame you because you didn't advise them properly. Jeff, I think, can confirm that, as an owner and as a former real estate commissioner.
For sure.
All right, part 13, title investing. Prelim. Prelim, basically, it's an offer from the title company to issue title insurance. That's all it is. They've investigated the property and said, I'll give you title. I will issue you title insurance if you want it. But the insurance is subject to certain things, subject to encumbrances. Like if somebody built a barn onto your property, or the lot lines are intruded upon. Easements, recorded easements, covenants, restrictions, any other matters affecting title. If it's an HOA, subject to all that. They insure the property against those things because they've investigated it, but they said, okay, we're going to insure all except for this stuff. That's subject to. Okay. One thing about how does buyer want to hold title? Don't ever recommend that. That's not your thing. That's not a realtor's scope. Okay. That's best done with their attorney, or the title officer can advise them if they want, but it's not up to the realtor. You tell them something and later on it's a big tax problem. You don't want to get involved in it. Okay. Now, title policy is it's insurance against defects that were not discovered during the title search. And it's not all inclusive. For example, if there's an unrecorded lien, the seller did a note, borrowed $10,000 from his buddy, but they didn't record it, and he secured the house on it. That's not going to be. There's no insurance on that. Now, I don't think they're going to collect it from you because it hasn't been recorded. But that kind of thing is not covered typically. Now, what time do we have? Okay, we're gonna go through this next section, and then we're gonna take a 5-minute break. This next section is, in my opinion, the most critical part of this contract that you need to know. Part 14. It's also the most misunderstood. And the only reason that it's misunderstood is because agents don't read through it. They just don't read through it when there's questions. But it has so many answers to your questions. And I don't understand why every agent doesn't just clip out all the 14 and blow it up and read through it, test yourself, and have it memorized. You would have so much more confidence. But we're going to drill down a little deeper on this paragraph 14 because I want you to at least have some light. I want not to be in the dark. Okay, part 1 of paragraph 14, seller delivery of documents. Okay, simple, explains how that works. Seller has to deliver to the buyer on time according to the due dates, reports disclosures, includes the statutory disclosures that we talked about. It includes things like leases and liens, past maintenance records. Okay, don't forget that. Repair invoices and receipts, any old inspections, home inspections, termite inspections, all that kind of stuff. Okay. I always ask my sellers, how about if we do a year's worth of utility bills too? Provide that to the buyer so they don't have to ask us. Okay. Seller delivery documents, huge responsibility. That's one of the things, it's one of their contract duties. This one, buyer review of documents, request for repair, contingency removal or cancel. Okay. This has so much information in it. Talks about, okay, the buyer has to perform investigation and inspections. And your job as a buyer is to review the disclosure, review those reports and understand them. Ask the questions that you need. Deliver signed statutory disclosures back to the seller. That's your job, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. They can request repairs using form RR, which is request for repair. Seller's under no obligation to do those repairs. Sellers actually doesn't even have to respond to the RR. There's nothing that says they even have to sign it or say I'm rejecting it. They can just ignore it if they want, technically. Buyer's job 2, remove contingencies by the due date. Must be done in writing. If they're not removed in writing, they remain active. Buyer can still cancel based on those 30 days in if you haven't removed them in writing. Now, request for repair. That's what this form looks like without the guy with the multiple tools. The form is just like it sounds. It's a request from the buyer to do certain repairs before closing. Okay. And all there's fill in the blanks. It needs to be delivered to the seller during the buyer's inspection period, not after. Now, the seller's choices are they can agree and do the repairs. They can agree to do some of the repairs, but not all. They agree to do none, say, no, I'm not going to do any of it. Or they could ignore the form altogether. But I'll tell you, the most common and the most efficient manner of handling repairs as a seller or a buyer, agree to a seller credit. A seller credit to the buyer and let the buyer do their own work. Okay? And that way the buyer is not going to rely on the seller finding the cheapest handyman he can to fix the stairs. Now, you're going to need to provide estimates and all that sort of thing to justify what you're asking for, but it works better. It's just credit $5,000, $10,000, whatever the case is. Okay, this works out best, but unless the lender requires certain repairs be done before getting underwriter approval. For example, Section 1 on a VA loan, or maybe the FHA or VA appraiser called something out. Oh, that roof is shot. That roof needs to be replaced, that sort of thing. Okay, but this is the document you use as a request for repair. Be cautious on this. Let's say you do agree to a credit. There's a place on the request for repair to put that. You put something like, oh, in lieu of all these repairs that need to be done, I'm going to do a seller credit. That goes to the title company, right? Like all the documents, right? And then the lender has access to it. Lender's going to go, what are all these repairs that the buyer's getting a check for? They might come in and do more investigation and underwriting, and they might require those repairs to be done. So be cautious. If you're going to do a credit, just do a credit. Okay. Next form. Go ahead.
A question at the end. I'll ask later.
Contingency removal. This is the form where you remove those contingencies in writing. You can remove certain contingencies, or you can remove all of them. In the contract, each has a due date, and this is the form you use to remove it. Now, let's say you write an offer, and the offer says, okay, I'm going to forego my inspection contingency. Well, you got to include this form with the inspection contingency removed with your offer, just so you know. Has to be included. Right? There's one for buyers, one for... Now, the buyers obviously have a lot of contingencies. The seller, the biggest one for the seller is the contingency that they have to find a replacement property. And that's, you see the form to look at. This one has hardly anything. This one is full. This is the seller one over here. So there's one for both. Sometimes the seller has no contingencies. Most of the time they don't. Okay, seller right to cancel. So seller can cancel if the buyer doesn't remove the contingency on time and the seller first issues a notice to buyer to perform, which gives the buyer 2 days to remove it. If the buyer doesn't remove it in the 2 days after the notice to perform, then the seller has the right to cancel. They don't have to cancel, but they have the right to cancel. And if the seller does cancel from this and the buyer doesn't remove the contingency, well, the buyer can get the deposit back. Same process for buyer contract obligations. A contract obligation is like the deposit to escrow, or the funds are not good. Still have to issue notice to perform. Or accepting leases or liens, return the seller disclosures on time. That's not a contingency, that's a contract obligation. Notice to perform for that too. Buyer right to cancel. It's right in, we're still on part 14. Buyer right to cancel. Okay, buyer can cancel. The seller doesn't remove their contingency on time. They have to do the same process. Same process. Things like the seller doesn't deliver their signed statutory disclosures, or they don't make the home available for inspections. Those are seller obligations. Now, the buyer may not want to cancel. They just want to get the stuff done. But what that does is it allows, if the seller is holding up the buyer's investigation process, they get to keep that. The seller can't force them to remove that in the 17 days until they do their piece, because they're related. So, you know. Cancellation. What does a cancellation look like? And what does it mean? It's not just, hey, I cancel, I'm done, bye. Give me my money back. So on the cancellation, so long as they have the right, so long as everything's done and the seller has the right to cancel, they've issued the notice to perform, blah, blah, blah. Either party can cancel without the other's agreement or their signature. Unilateral, they can cancel. Okay. Now, the second part of the cancellation is the disposition of the buyer's deposit. Okay. This has been known to cause a few disagreements and problems. Both must sign and agree before escrow releases the money. If you represent the buyer, you really need to watch all the time frames and the action instruments like the notice to perform, contingency removal, etc. Or you might be the reason your buyer doesn't get their deposit back. You don't want that. If the parties don't agree, well, it goes to mediation first and then either interpleader action or arbitration. Okay. Escrow doesn't want to keep that money. So if you don't do something about it, they could go into interpleader, which means it goes to a system, a justice system where, you know, you argue back and forth and somebody makes a decision and okay, you do the deposit. Or it could be arbitration. If it's a smaller deposit, it could be small claims court. Now, seller withholds the release of deposit without good reason. He may be subject to $1,000 fine and possibly the buyer's legal fees. So tell your seller, be careful. And the last part of cancellation is escrow. Even if the contract is canceled, etc., the escrow stays open until every matter is settled and closed. That might make it difficult to open a new escrow with the new buyer later. Yeah, but there's workarounds. If this happens to you, talk to me. Talk to me before it's trouble. Notice to perform. Okay. Notice to buyer or seller. It has to be in writing. Has to be signed by the issuing party. If the seller issues you a notice to perform for your buyer, the buyer doesn't have to sign it. It's unilateral. The other party has 2 days after delivery to perform. Can't be delivered earlier than 2 days prior to the due date of that item, contingency or condition. There's a notice to perform for the buyer. There's a notice to perform for the seller. And on the buyers or both, you can check off certain contingencies and contractual actions if they're coming due, or if all of them are due, just click them off. Okay, that's the process. Okay, the effect, if the buyer removes their contingencies, they're saying, okay, I've completed everything. I approve of all my investigations, my reports, my loan approval, all this stuff, and I can no longer cancel due to those items. My deposit is at risk. If the seller contingencies are all removed, that says the seller is satisfied regarding their contingency. For example, the replacement property, maybe they didn't find one, but they're going to just remove it anyway, whatever. But they can no longer cancel for those particulars. Okay. This is all in paragraph 14. Demand to close escrow. Other party fails to close on time. Doesn't mean the contract's canceled. They have to, you have to first sign and deliver a DCE, demand to close escrow. This provides 3 days after delivery to close. And you cannot deliver it sooner than 3 days prior. Some agents are going to give it to you 3 days before every time to get you closed on time. Some are going to wait till there's problems and then later on, but you still get 3 days to close after they deliver this. Now, if it's delivered incorrectly or too soon, it's invalid. It's no good. Okay. Don't confuse the demand to close escrow with the notice to perform. They're different forms. They do different functions. If a buyer or seller cannot close on time, they're in default. But once again, the other party can't cancel unless the DCE is delivered, the time passes, they don't close, now you can cancel. This is important too. Closing day, the performance day, we'll say, where the end of the 3 days. The same with notice to perform, by the way, has to be on a business day. So if day 3 lands on a weekend or a holiday, the performing party has till 11:59 p.m. on the next business day. Okay. Cancellation of deposits. the effect of it. If the buyer has no contingencies left and their deposits, it's at risk if they cancel or if they default. So, don't ever guarantee the disposition of the deposit to either your seller or your buyer, especially when it goes to it may go to arbitration or interpleader. Other factors might come out. So don't say, oh, I got it. Don't worry about it. You're going to get that, no problem. Just be really careful in the process. And like I said, every realtor needs to be an expert on 14. You really do. And if you don't study anything else and memorize, do this one. Okay. This next part, I'm going to clip through the next sections because a lot of stuff it's going to go through is confirming and reinforcing what we've already gone through in paragraph 14. So we're going to go through this next part a little more rapid pace. Okay. I'm going to be cautious of our time as well. I hope I'm anticipating maybe an extra 10 minutes. So if that's okay with people, that would be great. All right. Here we go. So now we're on number 15, repairs. What needs to be done? Needs to be done before the walkthrough. The seller can do the repairs as long as they're done. They comply with permits, law, in a skillful manner with the same materials. Keep in mind, some of them has to be done early, like VA termite work or items that require a second inspection. Be clear with the sellers in writing if they agree to do these. Final verification of condition. Do not ever do this on behalf of your buyers. Don't do it. Make sure they can do it or someone they know can do it and they know and trust, but not you. It could be a really sore subject after they move in. Trust me on that. Okay. Form looks like this. It needs to be done within 5 days, as it says in the contract, unless otherwise established. If the buyer finds unfinished repairs, debris, and junk all over the place, or other problems, they can either get an update from the seller of what's going on, or they're gonna, when's this all gonna be done? So there's communication rather than move in and it's all a mess and the seller isn't even moved out. Nothing worse than a disappointed buyer on move-in day. Prorations, simple. A proration is, for example, let's say that on property taxes that in a 6-month period, that 4 months worth, the seller's prepaid them and it's 4 months in. So the seller will get 2 months back and the buyer pays the 2 months. The same with HOA dues, assessments, rents, that sort of thing. So proration, that's done through the title company. Brokers and aid, this is a synopsis of when and how you're paid your commission. The buyer will represent they have a buyer broker agreement in place, and the commission coincides with what the seller has agreed to pay. The buyer is no longer required to provide that document with the contract like we used to. We did for a short time, if the seller agrees to pay. And also in the scope of duty, it states the broker will not decide what the buyer should pay, what seller would take, doesn't guarantee the condition of the property, or the inspections or the services or repairs. You're not responsible to inspect public records. This is a big one. You are not responsible to. But I highly recommend you direct your buyers to obtain and review them closely. Okay? You have to provide the right advice for them, but you don't do it yourself. You do not guarantee boundary lines, square footage, etc. If you're asked for legal advice, accounting advice, tax, insurance, or anything else that falls outside your scope, you should refer to a specialist, not answer the question, not research and answer the question. Here's 4 things you never want to say. Never. I picked those 4 because they get said all the time and it causes problems. You can see where that can be a problem later.
Yep.
Yeah. Part 19. Just in general, the RPA is basically serves as escrow instructions for the title company. That's why it says on the residential purchase agreement and joint escrow instructions. It is what it is. Basically, you do not guarantee service providers that you recommend. However, I strongly advise, more than strongly advise, you provide at least 3 choices. And don't say, oh, I use this person, they're great. They'll do it. They won't cause you any problems. Just say, these are the people, I've used this person several times. It's been fine for me, but just be careful. But it states in the contract, you don't guarantee their performance. Okay. The home is sold. The status and disposition will be reported and published, right? We all know that. But sometimes you have some really private buyers that don't want that private information, like what the purchase price was, photos that are left over, that sort of thing. So just make sure you may have some conversations with those private buyers. There is a way to get the photos off of the public sites, but stay within the MLS sites. And there's a form for that. But it's an MLS process, not an OPA process. Attorney fees. If you lose, especially if you're negligent, you might have to pay both sides of attorney fees. So make sure people get sue happy and they get a lawyer that says you don't have to pay me unless you get a settlement. But if they don't get the settlement, could have a problem. Assignment. The buyer has a right to, if let's say the buyer forms a trust or decides somewhere in the contract they want to, assign this contract to their own trust, they have the right to do that with no problem. But if they want to assign another buyer, they need seller's written approval. For example, let's say, Aunt Jane is going to come in as a third buyer 10 days in, they can do that with seller's approval. Or if Aunt Jane's going to replace a buyer or add a buyer, or if one of the buyers is going to drop out, that's all done with an assignment. It's an assignment. And the seller can't unreasonably withhold a request with a qualified assignee. That's what it states. Equal housing, that needs to be there. Stay in compliance because it is the law and it's the right thing to do. There's like 17 definitions in there. I'm not going to go through all 17. There's 3 that cause the most confusion. First one is as is. What does that mean? It means you agree to take the property just the way you found it. But so long as you have an active investigation contingency, you can request repairs. Seller's only obligated if they agree in writing. And the seller has to disclose all their material facts and defects. Okay. And no obligation to do anything unless it's in writing. That's what as is means. So people write as is on their offers. You don't need to do that. It's already in there. Okay. Days. Everything refers to calendar days with the exception of the delivery of the buyer's deposit. And that's business days. Leads to counting days. The day of acceptance, the day of the request, the day of whatever you wrote up is called day 0. Okay. Anything after is day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So day 0 is the day you write the offer and it's accepted today. That's day 0. If your due date to perform, to close, for example, falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, you have till the next business day at midnight to complete that obligation. People get confused on this. Okay. Liquidated damages in a nutshell. There's a couple of handouts there that are included in your package. You can also find those on the card website. Don't go beyond what I'm telling you. You give that to your client because it's written up by attorneys, this stuff, and it's interpreted. It can be interpreted different ways by different people and different attorneys. So don't play attorney. Liquidated, in a nutshell, though, liquidated damage limits the seller damages to the deposit paid or 3%, whichever is less. And it's designed to prevent high dollar lawsuits, damage suits. Keep in mind, liquidated damages is optional for buyers and sellers. And both of them have to consent to liquidated damages or it's not going to be part of the contract. It gets thrown out. Okay. If your client needs more detail, like I said, provide the handout or speak to an attorney is even better. It's liquidated damages. Mediation. The intent is to have the parties come to a financial settlement of a problem, of a dispute. And then the claim closes. It's always required. It's the first thing you have to do. It's not optional. You can't just go straight to court. Okay. If somebody refuses to mediate, then you're not eligible to collect attorney fees if you're the right party. the prevailing party. Keep this in mind. If the claim is small enough or it's different, if it's small enough to fall in small claims court, you don't need mediation. If it's in bankruptcy, probate, foreclosure, or unlawful detainer, no mediation. But a regular normal situation that goes above small claims, limit, which I think is 12.5, mediation is required. Arbitration. Once again, just give them the handout in a nutshell. In a nutshell, an arbitrator is a neutral third party. Usually it's like a retired judge or someone like that. And it's agreed to, both parties agree to that person. And the arbitrator listens to both sides, reviews the evidence, makes a ruling. The ruling is final. No appeals are allowed, no jury. Just like liquidated damage, it's optional. Most buyers and sellers do initial both, by the way. But don't push for signing or not. But you can share that the majority of our clients initial both, and they make their own decision. And once again, don't explain further than what we're talking about or what it says here. Okay. Misunderstandings happen. This part, in essence, if you or your buyer feel the appraisal was not on the up and up, this section explains the process to report it, what to do about it. If give the appraiser and the lender the chance to fix it, but if it's shady, this is what it is, because there are laws that protect against, appraisals that are slanted. Okay. 30, terms and conditions. Basically, it's a statement that just says all the parties understand what they're doing, right? Seller may continue to accept backup offers even after this one's accepted. They can still take backup offers. They can still market it as contingent. Parties agree they understand agency confirmation. If the buyer defaults, the buyer may be liable to pay broker compensation. That's listed in here. Okay. Once you, as the buyer or seller, sign the RPA, you are deemed to have read and understood all of it. And it can be signed in counterpart if that's necessary. With DocuSign, that's rare these days, but it can be, and still it's legitimate. Okay. Time is of the essence. Our whole contract's run by timeframes, yeah? That's why it says time is of the essence. That's how it works here. Okay. And in essence, it says this is the final, this is it. This is the deal. This is the agreement that we have. Everything is conducted with California law, and there's no changes to this contract at all unless in writing signed by both parties, buyer and seller. Keep in mind, you're not a party. The buyer and the seller are the parties. Legally authorized signer. Okay. Basically, if it's an LLC or a trust, power of attorney, that sort of thing, and you're signing on behalf of that entity, you have to provide evidence of your authorization to sign within 3 days. And it must be a good entity. It can't be an LLC that's going bankrupt. Okay. Look how fast we're going through this. The offer itself. Okay. Seller doesn't have to respond if they don't want. There's a place that they do, they initial and say whether they agree or they don't have to, though. That's a courtesy. There is an expiration period that's by default 3 days for them to respond unless you change it. If the seller doesn't respond, I suggest you utilize one of the car sample letters, which demand the listing agent presents the offer to the seller, because that is a legal requirement. The listing agent has to present it, unless you've talked to the listing agent and you're satisfied with, hey, that seller just won't do it. If you're satisfied, great, move on. Next. And sometimes the seller with a lowball offer, they just say, I'm not even going to give it the dignity of responding. Okay. But if this offer is just not to their liking, once again, they don't have to give you the time of day, but just make sure it's the seller hindering you and not the agent. That's why it's good to have good relationships with that other agent. Your business partners in this. You're not enemies. You're partners. Get this done. But you represent your person's best interest. They represent theirs. Acceptance. All right. This is the last section before we do the mock contract. Seller has choices. they have choices. The first, they can accept your offer as written, right? They can reject your offer. They don't like it. They don't even want to deal with you. They can counter your offer. Or they can offer you backup position. Okay. Most often it's one of the first three. So it is a counter. Counter basically, the seller accepts your offer so long as you accept their proposed changes and sign it. Now you got a contract. A counter offer technically creates a new contract. And if there's any previous counters, it replaces that. You can't just say, never mind, I'm going to go backwards and have a do-over on the last one I wrote. No, that one disappears once you submit this one. If the price changes up or down, if they counter you back on price, then let's say you have an 80-20 loan, well, that adjusts as well. So you still have an 80-20 loan. So those numbers will jive. Okay. For example, so that does not apply to the deposit though. The deposit, if it's a 3% deposit, that 3% will change unless it gets in the counteroffer itself. If the buyer or seller responds after the expiration time, there's a place for the other principals to sign, which makes it valid. Okay, so, my offer's expired. Well, okay, I'll give it to you a day late. There's a place in the bottom for you to sign that says, okay, that's fine. And we're going to go through that in the mock contract. One more thing before we get to the mock contract. A multiple counter offer. That means the seller is countering more than one person than you. There's more than one offer. Those others might be different than yours. The counter, they might be countering you back at 950, and they might be countering them back at 9 or 925, because maybe you have something they don't like, and they'll be willing to overlook it at 950. And if you accept that multiple counter offer they get back to you, it's not binding. You're not in contract yet. It's only in contract because they're going to get all the multiple offers back, review them, and they're going to either accept one of them and tell the rest sorry, or they're going to do another multiple counter offer, or maybe they're just going to do a single counter offer back to one of you. Okay, these happen. Okay, we're going to go through this more, the counter offer, when we do the mock contract. Same with the buyer counter offer. Okay, one more thing. What if your buyer changes their mind or wants to amend a counter that's already been delivered? Or what if you're the seller and the seller gets a better offer before his counter offer gets sent to you? No, you can withdraw it, but right away, call them, text them, email them before they accept it. You also need to submit CAR form WOO, withdrawal of offer. Legally, all you got to do is communicate it be withdrawn. To avoid a skirmish, do it in writing. But you don't want to sit and wait half a day or a day while your buyer gets ready to sign the woo. Meantime, the seller accepts it, and now you got another problem. Of course, you can cancel, but that may not be the path that your buyer wants to take.